Hello and welcome back to the Reptile Goth YouTube channel. As always, I am Morgan. Now, the video you're about to see was originally filmed as a project for one of my classes during the spring 2020 quarter. And I felt strongly enough about the subject matter that I think it's important to also release it publicly here on the channel. So any weird things in the format is because it was not originally filmed as a video for this channel. That being said, enjoy, guys. Hello, I'm Morgan, and today our topic of discussion is how climate change is affecting ecosystems and human society. We're going to begin our discussion of how climate change is impacting ecosystems by looking at king penguins, which are known to be a sensitive indicator species of environmental change. Now, these penguins are very similar to emperor penguins, except they breed on ice-free rocky islands, and their foraging grounds move with the polar fish species that they feed upon. And their foraging ground needs to be close enough to their breeding ground so that their offspring do not starve while the parents are searching for food. A study published in 2018 took data that tracked the movements of the largest king penguin colony and showed that as the climate was warming, the suitable habitat for these penguins was shifting, and as a result, the breeding grounds were shifting from island to island to keep up with that change in suitable habitat. They took this data and warming projections based on the different emission scenarios to model what might happen to this colony of penguins based on the different warming projections. Now, under the current emissions scenario, which assumes there's no changes in emissions at all, the projection is that 70% of breeding pairs will either move or be lost entirely, with 49% of the global king penguin population losing their habitat by the end of the century. However, under the low emissions scenario, which is not a total reduction of emissions, but just a reduced number, only some populations will be threatened. The image here shows a representation of that suitable habitat as the sea ice has receded since the last glacial maximum, all the way up to the projection for 2100, so the start of the next century. The teal you can see here is where the sea ice is or would have been, with the red line showing the perimeter of the foraging grounds. Now, the little numbered dots are the islands that could possibly be used for breeding grounds. The orange are the usable islands, blue are islands that are unusable because there's ice present. Gray islands are too far from foraging grounds, and the white islands are the ones that have no evidence of use. And here we see the historical period is where the data was collected from 1981 to 2005. Now, at the moment, you might be thinking, well, of course penguins are affected. They live on the ice, and any bit of warming is going to cause them problems. And that is why we're going to now move to the coast of Australia, specifically the western coast adjacent to the Indian Ocean, where the rate of ocean warming is in the top 10% globally. A 2016 study looked at the results of a marine heat wave. Now, this heat wave killed kelp forests, shown here in the image, labeled A, and replaced them with seaweed turfs, the bottom of the image labeled B. Now, the specific study focused on the period between December 2010 and early 2013. This is where the heat wave happened, and 43% of the kelp forests on that coast of Australia were lost. And this also represents a loss of that temperate marine ecosystem where the kelp forest was the base. And it replaced it with a subtropical to tropical marine ecosystem, which relies on the seaweed turfs. And the big difference here is that the kelp forest cannot survive in the warmer waters, but the seaweed is adapted to that warmer marine temperature. Now, by late 2015, when they were concluding the study, there was no sign of kelp returning in those areas, but there was an increase in the abundance of those tropical species, not just the seaweed, but also the other invertebrates and fishes that relied on the seaweeds as the base of their ecosystem. And the kelp that was remaining, shown here in this map that has color-coded the areas of lost and remaining seaweed, that remaining kelp was the furthest from that tropical border and the most protected from that heat wave. The question right now might be, but Morgan, those are marine environments. What does that have to do with what's happening on land? Well, good news for you is we are seeing shifts in the terrestrial environments. A study published in 2010 that looked at 30 years worth of data collected on 159 butterfly species at 10 sites along an elevation gradient in the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California showed that butterfly populations were shifting towards the higher elevations, corresponding to the warming of the climate in the mountains. Now, the species richness, or how many species were in the area, fell at 5 out of 10 of those sites representing the lowest elevations in the study. The species richness actually only rose at the one site in the study that represented the highest elevation. But not only was species richness shifting up the elevation gradient, there was also a decline in the alpine butterfly species that specialized in those higher elevations, consistent with the warming and drying of the habitat. Now, in this image, the lower two pictures are of alpine specialist species that were declining in abundance. And the top two photos are of more generalist species that were starting to thrive at those higher elevations. And the study is not only evidence that climate change is causing a shift in where species are found as they attempt to stay within their preferred temperature ranges and preferred habitat. It's also showing that climate change is affecting and influencing the biodiversity of areas, because you are seeing a decline in species, even though there are more species in the area. It does not necessarily mean abundance of all of those species is rising or even staying the same. The animal kingdom is not the only kingdom where we're observing shifts in the ranges of species that correlate with shifts in the climate. A 2017 study that reviewed 50 years worth of data tracking the distribution of different plant species in the state of Wisconsin showed that the shifts in distribution of these plant species over that 50 years correlated with regional shifts in the climate of the area as well. Now, these species were shifting with the changing climate. However, there was a lag in how quickly their distribution was shifting, because plants are not mobile like animals, whereas the butterflies could shift up and down in elevation almost at will, because butterflies can fly. I know that's the biggest shock here in this entire video. Butterflies fly. But plants are kind of stuck in their area once they grow. So for the species to be able to shift to more suitable habitat, it relies entirely on either throwing up new shoots from root systems or the distribution of seeds in future generations. And this study is projecting that as the rate of climate change increases, the lag in the shifts in the plant species is probably likely to increase as well. This study also noted that there's a lack of research in the area of how plants deal with the changing climate, specifically in how quickly they're adapting, how tolerant they are to these changes, and anything else that has to do with the climate change, plant distribution, and any changes in the actual molecular or physiological structure of these plants. So more research is definitely needed in this area to answer the question of how the base of ecosystems is going to be able to deal with this massive change in the climate. So the big question here is, so what? Ecosystems are shifting, but what does that have to do with human life? Well, as these ecosystems shift, these shifts will also cascade into the areas that impact human life and well-being. For example, creatures like mosquitoes that carry diseases like malaria are already being seen to pop up in greater numbers in locations where they previously were not able to survive. Their habitat is expanding because they thrive in these warmer, moister environments that we're seeing in the changing climate. The shifts in these marine ecosystems are threatening commercial fishing and any other industries that rely on those ecosystems for survival. So as fish, shellfish, and anything else shifts, so does the fishing industry. And in places where things like seaweed and kelp are sort of disappearing because the marine environment can no longer support them, you're gonna see these drastic changes just kind of snowball through those ecosystems and up to the human industries that rely upon them. And there's also an impact specifically on agriculture and food production. Now, there's areas that rely on snowmelt for water, and they're already being seen as faced with water shortages as the snowpack is not consistently reaching the levels that they need to provide water for those areas. There's an increase in extreme precipitation events that are resulting in the loss of crops due to root rot and other diseases that thrive in that extra moist soil that these crops are not necessarily meant to be grown in. Warm fall and early winter tends to lead to plants not building up the hardiness they need to survive this winter freeze. A warm winter or early spring leads to premature growth of plants and frost damage when the early spring does result in nights that still freeze over and frost forms. Summer drought and heat is probably the most logical example of damage to crops that people think of, because the crops are just lost if there's not enough water or it gets too hot. The crops may have poor quality, which also obviously affects those trying to consume it. And a lot of the crops impacted are also used for livestock feed. So if there's not enough feed for the livestock, that then cascades into the meat industry as well. But what can be done about all of this? Well, there's going to need to be policy changes to reduce the impacts of drought and decrease snowmelt on those areas that rely on snowmelt or enough summer rain to feed their crops. In those regions specifically, there's just not enough irrigation put into place because there's never been a problem with enough summer precipitation to keep the crops properly fed with the water that they need. There's a possibility to change where crops are grown and which crops are grown in different regions. And also there needs to be research into drought tolerance, as well as increased production in those crops in those regions that are facing drought. But importantly here, there needs to be a reduction in emissions to kind of counteract or slow the impacts of climate change, to allow for human society and ecosystems the time they need to adapt with the changing climate. Before I leave you all here, I just want to give you a few of my closing thoughts on this subject. No matter what happens in the future, the changing climate is going to impact the ecosystem and human society. And there needs to be careful thought and action taken to navigate these changes being thrown at the world. As well as anyone watching this video needs to think, am I really comfortable with the changes that are happening in the world and in the climate that can be slowed down or stopped if society makes a few changes to reduce emissions and increase sustainability? Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane B. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.